Hello, welcome everyone. Thanks for signing in to this webinar offered by the National Trust for Canada, Why Bill C-323 Matters for Canada's Historic Places and What You Can Do. Looking forward to sharing some information with you and hearing your questions over the course of the next half hour or so. We'll aim to stop talking at you in half an hour and leave 15 minutes or so for questions and discussion.
No.
The National Trust for Canada, many of you I think on the line know who we are. We're a national registered charity, completely independent of government. We run a number of programs, and these webinars are one of the more recent ways that we are able to make our tools and resources available broadly across the country. Today, our presenters, myself, Natalie Bull, I'm Executive Director of the National Trust for Canada. I've been with the organization for a little over 10 years and involved in various ways in almost everything that we're doing. And my colleague, Chris Wiebe.
I've been here for about 10 years as well, and I wear many hats, but you may know me best as the ringleader for the national conference we do every year.
I'm just going to take a minute to walk you through some of the technical features of the webinar. On the top left side of your screen, you can access both the chat and the Q&A features. You can use the chat feature to share comments and ideas with the group, with everyone on the line for this webinar. And it's also a way to let us know if you're having technical difficulties. We have our technician, Emily Boulet, standing by to field those kinds of questions. And you can also use the Q&A feature to post questions for the open forum that we'll host at the end of the presentation. And you can start typing in your questions at any time. You don't have to wait for us to ask for them. And we'll field them at the end of the session in the open forum. And I just want to let you know, too, that we'll be sharing all the slides from today's webinar after the event. You'll get an email link with access to the presentation, so don't feel that you have to furiously copy out all the text that you see on the slides. The National Trust, we have a long track record in advocacy. Obviously, as a registered charity, there are limitations on the amount of staff time and resources that we can invest in political activity, but we've always worked well within those limits and have managed to achieve some useful impact, as you can see from some of the actions listed there on the screen. Now I'm going to turn it over to Chris to tell you a bit more about the long history of the campaign for tax incentives in Canada.
So yeah, thank you, Natalie. It's been a long and winding road for tax incentives in Canada, and the National Trust has been working towards that goal with many partners for many years. Just put up some interesting images there. By way of context, at Canadian Confederation, under the British North America Act, oversight on private property was handed over to the provinces. So that leaves very few mechanisms for the federal government with which to intervene in the private property market. Two of those mechanisms would be grants, straight out cash to property owners, and also the Income Tax Act. So for that reason, we've settled on the Income Tax Act over the years as being an effective one, and also looking south of the border to the US, which we'll talk about in a moment. So the National Trust over the number of years has worked on different levels of campaigns. You can see some interesting pamphlets there in the 70s and 80s. We worked on the one on the left. We had a conference in '96 on tax incentives. There was that Landmarks Not Landfill campaign that we had that you can see on the right in the late 2000s. And every year we've sent in briefs to the Finance Committee in Parliament pointing to the need for federal tax incentive. So the drumbeat has been growing over the years.
Chris mentioned the U.S. tax incentive. It's been an important model. I think every conversation in Canada has been inspired by the success of the U.S. tax credit program. So you can see on the screen some of the extraordinary leverage achieved with that program. Every dollar invested in incentives has generated an investment of 5 times that from private investment. Great success in creating jobs and even creating affordable housing units.
So one of the other things that some of the things that the financial incentives could do, we thought we should highlight those as well, is there are studies in the U.S. and in Canada that show, you can see in that top bullet, that rehabilitation activity generates more jobs, skilled jobs, than the same investment in new construction, just given the hands-on nature of it, rather than assembling already prefabricated components. The environmental, the last three bullets, I won't go into super amounts of detail there, but I think the third bullet is particularly interesting in that it sets up this idea that green buildings are the best way forward, whereas studies have shown that it takes between 10 and 80 years for a new green building to make up for the negative climate change impacts of its construction. So that's a profound argument as well. And then on to why financial incentives are needed. We're going to go into some of the details around the reports that we've been looking at in recent days in a few minutes, but there's a gap. We're seeing a gap particularly for large and medium and large size projects. And there have been other interesting reports in the past. The Lazarus effect was one of them, looking at the difference in cost between new construction and older construction. We're recognizing that there is a gap in a lot of cases, and that there needs to be some kind of incentive to make it reliable and beneficial for developers. The return on investment, the financing from banks is difficult because of the unknowns in older construction, older building projects as well.
Many of you on the line will be familiar with the Historic Places Initiative, an extraordinary initiative led by a previous Liberal government, starting under Sheila Copps in about the mid-1990s. The Historic Places Initiative was really a strategic a program that was designed ultimately to achieve a federal tax incentive for Canada. And I'm not sure if everyone's aware of that, but early on in efforts to achieve a tax incentive, the National Trust and others were told that the only way finance would consider a federal tax incentive was if there were three important pieces in place. So one of them was a way to define the universe of properties that would be eligible for a federal incentive. And secondly, a way to define the standards to which the work carried out on these projects would be held. And then finally, to have a pool of trained agents in a position to look at the work completed on properties, judge it against the standards, and make a determination of whether the tax incentive could be granted to those projects. So interestingly, those of you who are familiar with the Historic Places Initiative will know that it focused on those three things. It created the standards and guidelines for the conservation of historic places in Canada. It defined the universe of properties that would be eligible by creating the Pan-Canadian Register, the Canadian Register of Historic Places, where all jurisdictions can upload their designated places. And then finally, it also trained a pool of what they were called certification agents in every province who actually practiced the process of reviewing the work against the standards and guidelines. And they were ultimately involved in the Commercial Heritage Properties Incentive Fund, which was exactly that, a pilot program designed to test the benefit and the appetite for a tax credit in Canada. So you can see from the screen, again, very successful. The investment in grants provided to projects across the country leveraged on average 8 times more in private sector investment. So you may be familiar with great projects that really are exemplars. The Centre Beam rehabilitation of a whole block in St. John, New Brunswick, the Lougheed building in Calgary. Both of those projects actually received the maximum amount of funding, $1 million under the grant, and it was applied with the 20% model similar to what we see in the US and what's now being proposed in Canada.
And so the National Trust has continued to, hone in on the utility of tax incentives through a number of recent studies. Some completed. The one on the right we're still working on. The one about financial measures to encourage heritage development was particularly fascinating because we were talking with upwards of 24 developers at length across the country and in different kind of contexts and circumstances, big cities, small towns, talking to them about what the challenges were and what the possibilities for incentivizing heritage rehabilitation would be. One of the things they brought up was return on investment, and there's often in larger cities where there's high property costs, the land issue is difficult, because how do you compensate for foregone development potential for particular sites? And in that way, small local grants are never going to touch or have an impact on those kind of situations, whereas tax incentives through the Income Tax Act could help move things along. So those developers there identified of chief interest to them, the things would be grants, tax incentives, federal tax incentives, and property tax relief. So they very clearly in their responses honed in on that. On the most recent report that we're working on is on heritage tax incentives generally, just looking at some of the smaller things there, and we're looking at all the provinces and territories across Canada and over 40 municipalities to see what they have, to get a good snapshot of what's out there, to identify the need. But what we're seeing is there's lots of small grants and incentives for owner-occupied buildings, but very little for the large and medium-sized projects, and they're left out in the cold at this point.
And those studies really are about keeping up the momentum. As many of us know, the Commercial Heritage Properties Incentive Fund, it was canceled in the pilot phase, so we weren't even allowed to see the pilot play itself out. But clearly there's still a lot of interest in Canada about continuing to move forward with the idea of a tax incentive. So you can imagine our pleasure when Bill C-323 was announced in December 2016. So just briefly, the bill, it's a private member's bill, so not a government bill, which puts it in a disadvantage and gives it a more challenging path through to royal assent and passing into law, but certainly not impossible. And we know from our own experience here at the National Trust, our work with the Railway Stations Protection Act, it started as a private member's bill and ultimately was successful. And so the purpose of our conversation today is to tell you more about this bill and how to work together to make it a reality. But I think no matter what happens with this bill, it's been such an important historic opportunity for all of us to open a conversation with elected officials and others about the need for federal actions to help save places that matter. So over to you, Chris.
So just really briefly on the measures into the bill, we can't get into so many of the mechanics, but it's quite broadly applicable, and Natalie will talk about that in a minute, about the applicability to commercial and also to owner-occupied residential. So there's two mechanisms. One's the 20% tax credit for eligible costs, and that would be applied to income tax owing, and it could be carried forward, those credits, for a number of years. And there would also be another mechanism. This would really only be of benefit to commercial properties, capital cost allowance write-off, which would be accelerated. Typically, there's been a lot of challenges around what is expensable in a given tax year and what needs to be capitalized over time and written down at a very modest rate of about 5%. Here they would accelerate. They would capitalize all of those eligible heritage costs, and they can be written off within 3 years, which would have actually quite a substantial tax benefit. You can see in our heritage measures to encourage heritage development, we've actually put together some fancy Excels modeling the impact of these very credits. So if you need some more information on that, I would go to that particular document.
Eligibility. So the bill as written is really designed to have very broad applicability. It includes, I think ultimately the intent is that any property on the Canadian Register of Historic Places would be eligible. The bill mentions National Historic Sites designated under the National Historic Sites Act, or sites that are designated under provincial legislation, and then ultimately if they're listed on the Canadian Register. And because it's a tax-based measure, obviously it's available to any entity paying tax. So that actually opens it up quite broadly as well to potentially to residential owner-occupied properties as well as commercial properties. And that actually takes it further than the U.S. tax, the U.S. rehabilitation tax measure, and also the early ideas that were being tested during the the Commercial Heritage Properties Incentive Fund pilot, which were really more focused on commercial properties. And so just a note to say that excluded from benefiting from this potential measure would be registered charities.
I'll just jump in quickly on that one, Natalie. In the United States, they have a mechanism called syndication, where charities can essentially sell their tax credits on the open market to for-profit companies to use. We don't have that mechanism here in Canada. There's an idea called limited property companies, which could be used in that direction, but it would be a new frontier for the Canadian market. So where do things stand now with Bill C-323? Well, it's gone through, why don't we look quickly at the passage of a bill in Parliament, just to get a better sense of what the trajectory of this thing is in the first place. Well, it went through first reading, it went through second reading and debate, and there was a vote, and we'll look at more closely at the results of that in a second. And then it goes on to a committee, where that's where the real meat and potatoes work of Parliament happens, is at the committee stage. They hone in, look at the very particular mechanics of a bill, debate the relative merits of it, and make any amendments, recommended amendments that they wish. If there are amendments to the bill, then it comes back to the House of Commons, the full House, and that's called a report stage reading, and those amendments are debated for two 1-hour sessions. And if the amendments pass, then it gets passed on to third reading, where there's a second set of 2 1-hour debates on the bill, and then there's a final vote. And we all hope these bills pass. And then it goes off to the Senate, where it finds further scrutiny, and then royal assent. So it has a long and winding road. And just to say, private members' bills often have a lot of challenges around their passing. And so the second reading vote results in the House of Commons, it was really fascinating. Natalie and I were there. It was a real nail biter, real electric atmosphere in the House. There were some other important bills being passed as well, or being voted on. And this one was really influential. It was very close. It was 150 yeas and 140 nays. There was conservative, solid across the board, conservative New Democrat and Bloc Québécois support for the bill. And there were 24 Liberal MPs also voted for the bill, which pushed it up over the top. So it really crucial were the letters of support from individuals and municipal resolutions from across the country. And also we must acknowledge the behind-the-scenes work of John Aldag, a Liberal MP from Cloverdale, BC, who's been a key Liberal representative working behind and in front of the scenes on this bill with his party. So some of the issues raised there, and I guess we'll get into that at various points in the rest of our slides, but some of the issues raised in second reading debate was around the cost of the bill. What's the universe of eligible buildings there, and what could be the potential cost of fiscal? The kinds of buildings, there was some concerns, particularly from the NDP, around this being a benefit for wealthy homeowners of mansions and other fancier buildings, which is a perception problem. And there was also the professional oversight idea that was brought up by heritage professionals, wondering about whether it would be heritage architects or others that would be signing off on these particular credits. So committee stage, where we're at now, the vote passed in March. So now we're waiting in mid-March. So now we're waiting for the bill to come to committee, and the committee is actually preoccupied with the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, and so they've been seized by that for the last number of months. But they have 60 sitting days to consider the bill that has been brought to them from the House of Commons. So there isn't actually that much time left in the parliamentary calendar. After the first week of June, the House will probably rise. So there's only I don't know, about 20 days between now and then, 20 sitting days. So I guess the time horizon is that maybe they will start getting to this bill by the end of spring, by late May, early June, or it'll happen in fall, in September, October. So it's a little bit elastic at this point in terms of when things will happen. Here's the Standing Committee on Environment and Sustainable Development. They're there from across the country, and it's important to look at some of these members. You can see there's John Aldag, the Liberal, who was on that committee as well. And we'll have to think about these people because they'll be a focus of our discussion attention over time.
So if you know these MPs, if you're in the ridings of any of these MPs, you want to be showing them love and sharing information with them.
So the committee work, preparing the dossier, this is just about the committee work itself. There will be, the committee will be calling witnesses to talk about the benefits or the merits of this bill and to clarify issues that they may have. And there will also be the opportunity for other submissions, written submissions, to help guide the committee in their work. There's some input we can provide, outsiders can provide to the witnesses that should come forward, but it's ultimately the committee's decision about who comes before them to discuss. And then there's third reading. So I think we described that. It's a long process where it comes back to the House to be debated after the amendments are considered, and then moves off to the Senate and royal assent and becomes law, hopefully.
Great. So getting to strategic considerations, how do we as a movement make sure that this bill successfully makes its way through the process and becomes law? We thought we would share with you. You may have seen these letters yourselves in response to letters that you wrote to support the bill during earlier phases. So we just put on the screen some messages from the letter the Minister of the Environment wrote to the National Trust in response to our letter, urging her to support the bill. And so basically, indicating that this is not under her purview, that it actually belongs to, that it's a finance question, and that she forwarded his letter along to the Minister of Finance, and then also pointing out what Parks Canada, which falls under the Minister of the Environment, is actually doing for historic places. So reference to the National Cost Sharing Program for Heritage Places and the Cultural Spaces Fund under Canadian Heritage. So I think a couple of messages here. I think it's really important for all of us to remember to say thank you for projects that receive that National Cost Sharing Program funding, and for projects that get funding from the Cultural Spaces Fund. And we've certainly started doing that systematically in our social media, tweeting our thanks for projects that get funding, tweeting at the Minister of the Environment. But we also need to be conscious of reminding the Minister of the greater need out there. And important, I think, for us to know the federal role in heritage. We look in parallel at the federal role in culture, typically carried by the Minister of Canadian Heritage. And so we all need to remind the Minister and ourselves that there is a broader federal role for the Minister that's laid out under the Parks Canada Agency Act, and also as a country that is a signatory to the World Heritage Convention, that there is an obligation to put in place programs and measures that help Canadians protect places that matter.
So we thought we'd just put up the typical, some of you may have seen from your letters, the responses to your letters from perhaps from a Liberal MP. Liberal MPs, there was a certain kind of standard letter that they'd sent out with these kind of responses. And you'll see from the first paragraph, it's talking about, the fiscal choices that need to be made by the government and the challenges there. It's challenging at this point to bring forward a new tax credit idea because the Liberals, this particular government, is actually eliminating some of these boutique tax credits like the fitness and the arts tax credits. So they're obviously interested in simplifying the tax code. The second paragraph, they talk about potential inequities between heritage homeowners and existing homeowners. I think from what we've talked about earlier, there's already an existing inequity, whereas that privileges existing homeowners where they get GST rebates on new homes that they purchase, and also just in terms of the cost of handling older homes, there are additional costs that aren't there for new ones. And then the third paragraph, Peter Van, is talking about referring to technical flaws. Peter Van Loan's people are the crafter of the bill. Does not believe this is the case and is working through a response to that. And then there's also, in the fourth paragraph, there's a concern about there's no upper limit on this bill and the cost to the federal government. There's no sort of ceiling to it. One of the challenges for us is that the compelling nature of this bill, it comes from the fact that it's universal, that the tax credit is universal, that there is no kind of limit around it or fence around it, that it's predictable, and that's what makes it effective rather than a granting program with a finite pool of money available for people.
So what can we do? What can you do? Number one, say thank you to the MPs that you wrote to and asked to support this bill and who indeed did support it during the vote at second reading. Again, I can't stress enough, we are always asking for things to happen in the heritage movement, but we often forget to say thank you for the things that do happen. And this was certainly something that we were urged to do. We did write to all of the MPs who supported the bill to express our thanks. And we all need to keep up that positive pressure to remind MPs that there will be another vote, and we definitely need their support moving forward.
We also need to maintain existing support, and we have a conservative support and Bloc Québécois support for this bill. There's also NDP support. I mean, it's a little bit provisional in that they wanted to have the issue around the potential benefits of wealthy homeowners addressed. One of the challenges, I think, one of the key challenges will be for us to maintain the support we saw at second reading from those 24 Liberal MPs who voted to send it on to committee work. If you put together the two numbers, 150 yeas, 140 against sending it off to committee at second reading, that's 290. There's about 330 MPs in the House of Commons, so 40 MPs actually didn't have a chance to vote. They weren't there. They were off on their ridings or what have you. So we need to maintain those Liberal MPs there and expand that number if we want to be successful when it ultimately comes to third reading. So one of the ways to help bolster that support will be to increase the number of municipal resolutions, and we've had a lot of them, and you'll see come in. And this is the list here. Most of them are from BC. BC was very, very vigorous on this, and a lot from Alberta too. And there's a few from smattering from the rest of the country. It'd be good to have more from Ontario, and good to have more from across the country in a more representative fashion from Saskatchewan and Manitoba, etc. To bring home the fact that this would be a broad benefit to Canadian communities. I mean, this group right now, it's fantastic to see there are smaller communities and a mix of that and bigger cities. So that also helps sort of allay some concerns that would only benefit small or large municipalities.
And then action number 4, we need everyone to work hard to increase the number of individual letters of support that have been received by MPs. So lots of information on our website, guidance, background information to help write your letter if you haven't already done so. And even if you have already done so, I would urge you to continue the flow of information to MPs and to reach out beyond MPs that have already been approached. Again, especially Liberal MPs, so that's where the real emphasis needs to be, and Liberal members of the Environment Committee, which is the committee ultimately that's now considering this bill and raising issues about it. So write to your MP, ask for a meeting, or do both of those things. Make it personal. They're really not swayed by form letters. It's really about bringing real examples of places in their riding that could benefit from the measures in Bill C-323. Write a letter. Again, we talked about getting a letter back from Catherine McKenna. It really doesn't hurt to continue to the flow of information to the Minister of the Environment, who ultimately is responsible for built heritage and historic places in Canada. Write a letter to one or more members of the Standing Committee on Environment and Sustainable Development. I see one of the questions coming into us is which committee. That's the committee, Environment and the Standing Committee on Environment and Sustainable Development. So feel free to write to one or more of the members of that committee. Again, I would suggest putting a priority on Liberal members. And for your letters, please don't forget to copy the National Trust. We are keeping a tally of all of the letters of support received, and we're in a position to look at which MPs have been contacted. Also copy the Minister of Finance and the Honourable Peter Van Loan, who is the sponsor of the bill, so that all of those entities are aware of the volume of support that's flowing out there.
I would also say, in addition to individual letters, it'd be great to see if you have friends or people, contacts in the development industry or in the business community that could bring it alive, the utility for this bill. I think that would be great if you could reach out for them, and if they could hear from them and not just perhaps from the advocacy or kind of the government policy-making community about this bill. I think that would really be helpful. And heritage homeowners, if there's people within your networks people that are maintaining designated buildings and that could really benefit from this, if you could encourage them and bring it to their attention, that would be incredibly helpful.
So just a few words now about the committee stage. Chris mentioned to you that the bill has now been referred to the Standing Committee on Environment and Sustainable Development. And so the process will be to organize a series of witnesses and to provide written briefs and presented briefs to that committee to give them a fulsome picture of the need for these measures and the benefit that they could have for historic places and for the economy in Canada. So if you're involved with an organization, please consider preparing a brief, and we'd be happy to work with you on that. If you have suggestions of witnesses, for example, Chris and I have been making suggestions about bringing someone from the US who can talk about the beneficial impact that the US version of a tax incentive has had. Some of the recipients of CHIPIF funding, those are all great representatives who can help paint a picture of why these measures are needed in Canada. Examples of endangered places, again, we're constantly collecting that kind of information, but please be on the lookout and build that kind of information into your own letters and briefs, and please share it with us.
I'm seeing a question there from that someone has raised, and maybe we can answer it in the question and answer period about the...
Yeah, and I think we're, so the next slide just shares some of the resources. We should have our website address there. I think you all know at nationaltrustcanada.ca, and it'll be on the screen later on. But we've got lots of material to help you build your own letters and briefs. And so now why don't we just move into the question period. So we do have 3 questions already open on the books. So the first question is about which committee is looking at the bill. And so just to repeat that again, it is the Standing Committee on Environment and Sustainable Development. And I think if you Google that, the House of Commons committees, you'll find online the names and faces of all of those members, including which political party they represent.
Another question is, whom were the 24 Liberal MPs that supported the bill? We can make that list available to the question asker here. But I mean,
I think it's on our website.
Is it on the website? Yeah.
You can see check how your own MP voted and see how everyone voted on the bill.
I mean, we do know that the Liberal cabinet was whipped on the bill, so that they were required to support the bill, and that there were people within the cabinet that were sympathetic to the goals of the bill, but weren't able at that time to support it.
So we're still here to take questions. We've got some time left, and while we're waiting for those questions to be typed in and pop up on our screen, I'll just maybe run you through a bit of information about other resources we offer. So this webinar is actually part of our Regeneration Works program. Regeneration Works is our portal for information, tools, training, coaching opportunities, all around helping you improve the vitality of historic places. So the portal at regenerationworks.ca includes a self-assessment if users come into the portal and are wondering what kind of information might help them tackle the challenges they're facing. There are also a number of tip sheets, and right now there is a lot of great content at Regeneration Works on fundraising for historic places, so all different kinds of fundraising and revenue generation information available. We've got a discussion forum. You can join the discussion forum and raise questions and become part of a conversation. And we also offer many more webinars like this one. So you can see on the screen upcoming webinars, the power of the crowdfunding, all around our upcoming This Place Matters competition, which offers opportunities to win and raise funding for your historic places. Telling your heritage story, and how to use social media to attract support for your historic place. Oops. And coming up in the fall, we hope to see you all at our national conference in Ottawa, October 11 to 14, a partnership with the Association for Preservation Technology International.
And you won't be able to get away from the discussion around tax incentives there, because there's going to be sessions and other things on it there, so be prepared.
So here's a question: how do municipalities ensure their local registers are on the Canadian Register in their entirety? So I think that's a very good question. There is an ongoing relationship between Parks Canada and the provincial heritage agencies in every province and territory. And so I think municipalities really should be checking in with their provincial heritage department. We're not actually involved in that process, so we don't have a lot of detail, but certainly it's important to note that I think the Canadian Register of Historic Places sort of fell fallow over the last few years because the real incentive to be listed on the Canadian Register was the potential to be eligible for formerly the Commercial Heritage Properties Incentive Fund and the idea of a future tax incentive. So now that a tax incentive is on the radar again, it's important for that register to be populated and for it to be clear that there are places that are interested in receiving that kind of funding. So I think the short answer is municipalities should be checking in with their provincial heritage department to confirm that those listings are continuing to be uploaded.
Another question that's coming in, Chris, here about that from Alberta. It was a question about heritage designation and the concerns that an individual heard at a recent forum that heritage designation would have an impact in lowering their property values. It's interesting in this discussion because heritage designation is one of the foundations of the prerequisites for this incentive. There's actually a lot of studies out of the Heritage Resources Center in the University of Waterloo that I can refer that person to, looking at the impact of heritage designation on property values. And actually it shows that they go up because they're in heritage, often in historic districts, and that help to provide that kind of solidity and regularity to the property values. Individual standalone buildings have also been studied to a certain extent, and they have fared very well because of their uniqueness in a gradually changing marketplace. So I can refer you to those studies.
It's possible that those kinds of misconceptions are really grounded in a fear of having someone impose some kind of control over your property. And really, I think incentives like a federal tax incentive are exactly about providing the sort of carrot to counterbalance the stick idea that a tax incentive would become a huge motivator for people to consider having their properties designated. A question about how a federal tax incentive would work with Main Street regeneration. And for example, right now in Saskatchewan, some provinces have a provincial Main Street program. The National Trust offers Main Street training and services across the country. So Main Street, I think, it's a good fit with a tax incentive. Any measure that could encourage a property owner to invest in their property, to incentivize them to do so, is a great fit with Main Street. I know in the U.S., typically the tax incentive is happening with much larger projects, but I don't think there's any reason why a smaller project couldn't benefit.
I don't know if we've mentioned it in the course of the presentation, but in the U.S., the federal tax credit there of 20% has often, right after that, many states have come in with their own state level historic rehabilitation tax incentives of 20%, and they've been, most of the 30 or so of those tax credits are stackable. So you get a 40% tax credit for heritage rehabilitation work in a number of states. So that becomes an incredibly compelling foundation for doing work on commercial strips like main streets.
So we've got a few more minutes if there are any additional questions. We're standing by. Great. Well, maybe that's a wrap, as the slide says. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating, and feel free to get in touch even after this session with questions. You'll be getting an email from us, as I said, with a link to the slide deck, and hoping that you'll consider participating in future webinars with the National Trust. There's our contact information, and again, thank you so much. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Natalie. It's been fun.